Okay, hi everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Makdisi Street podcast. We're really happy today to have with us Michael Fakhri, who I'll introduce in a second. But before we start, I'm compelled, as usual, to ask our viewers and our listeners to please, if at least those that are enjoying the show, to please put a 5-star review on the podcast, or like it on YouTube, subscribe, because the podcast, in a sense, is coming under some attacks here and there, and so it's not really for our vanity. It's really to boost the podcast and the YouTube channel and make sure that it reaches people outside of our kind of smaller circles. So we would very much appreciate that. And then the second part is also a reminder that we have Patreon. For those that would like to support the show, you can go to the Patreon website, which is in the link where the YouTube or the podcast is in the information part, and you can subscribe if you'd like to support the podcast. So thank you for that, and that was just a short announcement. So for today's episode, we're very happy, and I'm joined, of course, as usual, by Sari, my brother Sari, and Osama, and we're really very happy to have Michael Fakhri, Professor Michael Fakhri, with us on this episode to try to understand, and to talk about, and if possible, to kind of make sense of what's going on in Gaza today, with a focus on the question of famine, on the question of food security, food sovereignty, and this what appears to be this incredibly destructive and, at least from our perspective, quite intentional kind of starvation, or mechanism of starvation, that's going on, that Israelis are using today. And we're very happy to have Michael, who's the perfect guest for us, because he was appointed in 2020 as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to food by the UN Human Rights Council. And so he's been in this job for 3 or 4 years, and I'm going to ask him a little bit more about this. But again, just by short way of introduction, Michael is also a law professor at the University of Oregon School of Law, and he directs the Food Resiliency Project in the Environmental and Natural Resources Law Center. And he has a bunch of scholarly and kind of policy articles, but I want to mention just a couple of his 2 books. The first of which is Sugar and the Making of International Trade Law with Cambridge University Press. And he's also the co-editor of Bandung, Global History and International Law, Critical Pasts and Pending Futures, also Cambridge University Press. And this is also a very important book that was cited by the International Court of Justice, that we've been kind of talking about quite a bit in this podcast series. Michael has been around the world. He's given lectures around the world, and is also, I think, very interesting for us as well. Maybe be something to highlight, which is that he's also led a bunch of public dialogues on human rights and development, which is the intersection that he works on, with peasant organizations, labor unions, and human rights activists throughout the Arab region, but also North America, and at various international organizations. So he's involved. Michael is very much involved, not just in this very theoretical or academic setting, which of course he is, but also very much on the ground, and not just in the Arab world, but kind of across various regions. So he can give us as well a kind of comparative approach as well. So Michael, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. And as usual, we'd just like to start, if you can just elaborate, tell us your journey, how you got to be interested in the matters of food and trade, and that kind of takes you to this being a UN Special Rapporteur.
Yeah, thank you, Karim, and thanks, Osama and Sari, for having me on the program. I'm really been a big fan of the podcast since, I mean, I know you only started recently, but it's already sort of, I think, dominated a lot of conversations and debates in a good way. So I'm just super excited for this to be an opportunity to reflect with you all. So I started sort of my journey with a question on international trade. I started off as a student activist in the late 90s, and that's when a lot of people were mobilizing against international institutions that were pushing a particular form of globalization, and the WTO was one of those targets. And as a student activist, the question I had was, what is the World Trade Organization? What is the WTO? And I carried that question up through into my doctorate, into my first book, and I expanded that question into a question of, why did we invent international institutions, multilateral institutions, as a way of doing trade? We can trade, and humans have traded in all sorts of ways throughout the millennia. And there's a particular historical moment where we invent this form of the multilateral institution. And I suspected that the story would have to do with food and agriculture, because I was coming from a tradition of international law, third world approaches to international law, which understands that the creation of international law was in and of itself an imperial project. So in my mind, if I'm thinking imperialism, if I'm thinking multilateral institutions, I knew there was an agricultural story somewhere. So I was looking for one particular commodity to allow me to tell that story, and it was sugar. So sugar let me tell that story from the mid 19th century, from around the 1850s, 1870s, up until the 1970s, where the book ends. But then my research continued, and so I needed to take the time to tell the story of international trade from the 1850s until the present, to tell the story of how did we create these international institutions. And in bringing it into the present and going back to my activism, that brought me to food sovereignty, because one of the main organizations that was fighting against the WTO in the 90s and against the sort of hyper capitalist version of globalization was the food sovereignty movement. This was, for one of the major organizations was La Via Campesina, but it expanded to other organizations. And then food sovereignty as an idea expanded, so one can talk of food sovereignty movements in the plural, I think, now. And a friend of mine said that I basically am now a character in my own research, is what I've done. So I was sort of studying the history of all of this, and now, and the reason, we can talk about this in a little bit. I applied to be a special rapporteur was I wanted to go make friends with the food sovereignty movement. I wanted to go become a comrade of the food sovereignty movement, get to know them, but also to get to know the trade unions, and to take this historical knowledge that I had sort of developed and learned with friends and comrades. And I wanted to connect my international legal tradition more directly to this particular movement, which highlights the fights over food are kind of the fights over everything. It's the fight over land, over a way of being, a way to relate with nature, with space, with all of it. So that's sort of so I started off very much a trade and development person, and end up a human rights person focusing on the right to food, out of I think sort of necessity of the political landscape and just where my research went.
Yeah, so Michael, could you just elaborate for our listeners and viewers what is third world international law? You mentioned this, so can you explain what that means, and how does that differ from international law, as you said, the imperial project of international law?
Yeah. So third world approaches to international law is, one can think of it as a movement of academics, of scholars. It comes together, sort of starts in the 90s, and is really taken off, and continues to ebb, and it continues to grow and expand. And it's a comes from a tradition of international law. So third world approaches is what we call today third world. The idea of third worldism is considered outdated by many, but the idea is that it comes out of the sort of liberation movements of the 50s and 60s, but even the ones that predate that. And it comes out of different movements, intellectual, political, and the like, that take the world in this way, which is to say, international law was created from the beginning as a way to dominate, to occupy land, to dominate people, to subjugate people. And if you don't take that seriously, then you are ignoring the core aspect of international law, that you cannot ignore the imperial, both history and continued imperial project that is international law. But this contemporary version of it today is to say that just as international law has this big imperial drive, and always has, it's never, and it's changed in its form and its dynamics and its style and all of that, but built into that is also a history of resistance against imperialism. So that international law is defined by this constant tension between those that are wanting to dominate, and then these different moments of liberation, of resistance. Some would say, and renewal of international law, but I would say maybe even sort of changing our very understanding of what is international law. So that's what, and third world approaches is one style of doing that. There are other traditions. Indigenous peoples have also those traditions. There are overlaps between the two. There are differences. Um, there are feminist approaches, there are queer approaches. And again, all these movements, intellectual movements, overlap and intersect. And, today I will situate myself more squarely in sort of this third world approach. That's my home, I would say. That's my intellectual home. That's where my thinking starts, and I go from there.
Michael, so can you just to push you a little bit more on this, on the question of this third world approaches, this what's the Twail, right? I think that's the acronym.
That's the acronym.
Yeah. So in these approaches to Twail, so you've taken these approaches, these third world approaches, which focus in a sense on the resistances to this larger kind of colonial, empire project within which international law kind of comes from. And you have these resistances that come from states, but also non-state actors, right? I mean, it's both state and non-state actors, and this has had this long history, at least over the past century. And so, how is it now? By the time you become, as you said, you kind of a character in your own story, and this as a UN Special Rapporteur. Realistically, how do you go from studying this stuff and being a little bit on the margins as a critical kind of scholar into the belly of the beast itself in the middle of this empire where you're trying to push, you're trying to advocate? So what is it that you do as a special rapporteur in a sense, and for food, and at the same time, can you bring these things, or are you hitting yourself on a wall?
Yeah. Oh, that's a tough question at the outset. I think so. Coming into the position, I think it's always healthy to come in with an ambivalence towards law, and that's I think what I was trained in that third world approaches, which is to say I'm for or against law. Oh, is almost meaningless. It's to understand law in all its complexities as a particular form of power. Now, as someone who plays the role as a UN Special Rapporteur, one of the jobs that I have is I speak with a voice of authority. That was unique. That was new. I'm now no longer, I can't be playful or ambivalent or academic and sort of say on the one hand and on the other hand. I have to have a clear position, and that position carries weight and a responsibility. And I should explain how I understand the position of a UN Special Rapporteur. UN Special Rapporteur means that I'm given authority by the Human Rights Council, and this is how I've interpreted, to be the eyes, ears, and sometimes good conscience for the UN system on a particular mandate. My mandate is the right to food. So on all matters regarding hunger, malnutrition, and famine from a human rights perspective. So as the name suggests, it's to describe, it's to report. I treat it almost like my job is to learn from everybody as much as possible, and then to share what I've learned as publicly and as widely as possible. So in some ways I have to play the role of the expert, but I also have to play the role of a very good student who can learn very quickly and share what they've learned very quickly. So now that I've have to speak with a voice of authority, I am a leading interpretive actor on what does the right to food mean in particular contexts, in particular situations. And my job is to identify where there are violations, to use the language of violations, where there are problems, where there are examples of good things, where things are working well, where people are coming together and figuring things out. And so that's one power. The other power that all mandate holders have is we set the agenda in when we choose the themes of our reports. We report one report to the Human Rights Council a year and one report to the General Assembly. So we force governments to say something on the record about a topic or a theme that we choose and we decide. So my colleague Francesca Albanese just put out her report on genocide. She's the Special Rapporteur on occupied Palestinian territories. My forthcoming report to the General Assembly will be on starvation with a focus on Gaza. So we force the political agenda in a particular way. And we receive complaints. People say, they tell us this, my rights have been violated. We write official letters to governments. Governments must respond. So we create an official record in a lot of different ways. That's the job. So to go back more directly to your question, Karim, it's the challenge then is to take people seriously, to take movements seriously, to take politics seriously. But I'm not too worried about protecting or preserving any institutional anything about the UN. I'm not. If the problem is the UN itself, so be it. If the problem is international law itself, so be it. So I'm not the type of special rapporteur that says, if only they applied international law in the correct way, all will be fine. My job is to first identify how international law has created the problem, has been a part of a lot of the problems we have today. And this is the hard part, and point a way forward through the existing institutions, through the existing laws as they are, but doing it in a way hoping that it will then change the very nature of institutions and law itself. And the way I do that is, it's not a theoretical exercise. We could all sit and invent some nicer version or some more critical version of international law, but that's neither here nor there. The way I do it is, and the reason I picked the right to food as my entry point into all of this, is it's through social movements. It's through people's ability to organize, mobilize, and create that social energy, that social power. That's my theory of how change happens. Whatever the legal tactic is, whatever the institutional space is again, that's a tactical decision. But as long as I situate myself within the food sovereignty movements as part of a wave, of part of that, as one actor who has one foot deeper in the institutions than others do, but also one foot out because I am independent. I'm not paid. I have no, so that independence allows me to be to allow that inside outside strategy, so that what I always tell the movements, the stronger the movements are and the stronger their solidarity is amongst each other, the more powerful and the stronger I can be as an institutional actor. And then the more we can work together, then the stronger all of this can be in the long run. So that's how I've gone about it.
Michael, thank you. This is super helpful for all of us. And as you may know, Usama and I, unlike Karim, are not scholars of international law. So you can expect some more naive or uninformed questions from us compared to the questions you're going to get from Karim. But on this question in particular, what you were just saying here about the relationship between, let's say, UN organizations or institutions within the UN, like obviously like the Human Rights Council, all of the special rapporteurs, the General Assembly, the ICJ, and so on. And on the other hand, bottom-up organizations, community organizations or popular mobilizations or things like that, for example. One of the guests we had on the show a few weeks ago was Richard Falk. And part of the point he was making to us, and it's a kind of part of his broader kind of message to the world, is that international law partly has to do, like, we should look to the institutions of international law, not, and this is my naive question now, or uninformed question, not so much in terms of, will the ICJ act, or will some institution act, but rather what are the forms of legitimacy that these institutions can basically, I don't want to over paraphrase him or speak for Falk, but that can give to, let's say, popular struggles or movements for example, protest or boycott or whatever, things like that. So I assume that's kind of on your wavelength as well, but if it's not, if you could clarify that'd be very helpful for us.
Yeah, thanks, Sari. No, I think that's, I mean, to start with, Richard Falk is always an excellent place to start. I mean, he's someone many of us continue to learn from. And so I think that, but I would add to the dynamic. So yes, one power that international law and international institutions can be that they can provide added legitimacy to these movements. And the other thing they do is they can create a sense of meaning. What does this all mean? What are the stakes? And so it creates a particular political landscape as well. But I have to. I'm always a little careful then to not overstate the power and legitimacy that law and institutions provide, because sometimes we want to resist them as well, right? Sometimes they do something that is horrific, or they land in a way, or they interpret something in a way, or they give meaning to something in a particular way that people want to mobilize and push against. So so I would open it to say they have a power of creating legitimacy and a power of creating meaning. And if it can align with broader movements, usually then that can work in a particular way. But it's also important that movements retain the right of resistance against those very institutions themselves. For example, yes, the International Court of Justice. What a bizarre moment where so many people, everybody I know, was watching live the proceedings of the International Court of Justice, and when South Africa was making its submissions. My mother now is an expert on ICJ process, right? Like everybody was glued to whatever screen they had of the ICJ. I would have never, and as a critical international legal scholar, it's been popular. It's cool for us to be like, oh, ICJ, how relevant is that to the real life, et cetera, et cetera. But there's this moment, and of we were all really taking this institution very seriously. And what did it do? It gave us very muddled language that didn't do much, that Israel is going to ignore anyway. Did it really change human life in real time? No. Did it make it easier to demand for a ceasefire? To some degree, yes. It added some political power and legitimacy. But I mean, we should be criticizing the ICJ. Why didn't they just say ceasefire now, full stop? And then you watch all the legal arguments start to come. They couldn't do this and they couldn't. So you learn from these moments, these institutions, what they do and they don't do reveals a lot of power dynamics that we might not see otherwise. So that's why I think it's worth engaging, not necessarily and always trying to win, whatever that definition is in political tactical terms, but also open to, even if you quote unquote lose, you didn't get what you wanted. But what do I always ask in every encounter with colleagues and comrades and friends in this line of work that I'm doing as Special Rapporteur? What did we learn? What did we learn from this interaction? We pushed, the institution responded in a particular way. What did we learn? And it allows us to calculate our next move as quickly as possible.
Michael, if I could jump in here. So I'm trying to understand something. It sounds like, and this is coming from, of course, a friendly place. This is a friendly amendment or question. And the question is, so you said earlier that on the one hand, you're deeply skeptical of, and you were trained to be as a critical international legal theorist and scholar and activist. You were trained to be deeply critical of international law. So what do you say to those of us or the many people around the world who say precisely this, that there is no point putting any faith in international institutions, given how serially they've let down the peoples of the world, especially in the third world? That's question number one. So in other words, rather than have your cake and eat it, why put any faith in these institutions? And why work within them, given their record? That's question number one. Question number two is, maybe this is maybe too academic a question, you can ignore it, but I'm trying to understand what third world means, why you're using the term third world approaches in the 1990s, after the third world project has essentially been crushed by Western sort of neocolonialism or Western imperialism, debt, and what happened after the smashing of the liberation aspects of the UN in the 1970s. So I'm wondering, why even hold on to this idea of third world? Why not something else? I'm just curious. And these are two separate questions.
Yeah, thank you, Osama. They're two separate huge questions. So here we go. On the first one, if anyone is deeply frustrated, skeptical, and fed up with international law and institutions, they are 100% correct. So the response is mobilize, organize, protest, make a stink, yell as loud as you can, and push against these institutions by all means. That's I think a rational, healthy, normal response. I'm the one who bears the burden of the ambivalence of a foot in and a foot out. Leave it to those of us that, for whatever reasons of life is taking me in a particular journey, that I am situated in this space. But I'm in this space not because, again, I don't have faith in these institutions. These are the institutions we have. So any transformation, any change is going to come either through the wreckage of these institutions, or whatever's, or sort of some sort of salvaging of these institutions after they are proving themselves irrelevant, immoral, all of these things. So I think that's so I would encourage people to hold that skepticism. That being said, what's interesting to me, I have to admit, what has always forced me to keep myself in check politically is how many times I've heard Palestinian activists who in Gaza and in the West Bank who are living the horrors of international law but every single day often then turn to international law as a language and as a form of resistance. That's actually what forced me to stay in it and not just really disengage. And it's not by chance that some of the best international lawyers we have in the discipline, in the field, are Palestinian. It's out of necessity. Yes, we all study hard and work hard and sure and all of that, but there's I mean, this is not a scientific answer, but there's probably an overrepresentation of Palestinian international lawyers out of necessity. But what I can say is some of the best international legal thinkers of our time are Palestinian. So there's something about the same with the food sovereignty movement. They used sovereignty as their form of resistance, which in my mind, I thought, and this will connect to your second question, Usama. Why, out of all the things they chose, sovereignty, after what we all, the post-colonial project, many of us, I'll speak for my Lebanon, hooray, we got our state. What a grand success that was. Well done, Lebanon, we got a state. Great. What a disaster the post-colonial state was. So many of us get our sovereignty in the form of the state, and it turns out that we just changed what the oppressor looked like. Now they just look like it's now looking in the mirror, but the techniques and the forms, they just continued advancing those same techniques of the past. So there's something about international legal ideas that captures popular imagination that I think that I take very seriously, despite my critical training and all of that. And that's where I remain, where I think there's dynamism there. To your second question on I wasn't around when they picked the term, but they pick it in the 90s, and I can see why, right? So they pick it in the 90s when it's so dated. The Third World Project is really nothing is left of it by then. And I think it was a way of expressing a continuation of a particular tradition that was from liberation and anti-colonial histories and politics. And then I think the movement just continued. And so the idea of what and where is the third world from the beginning of this movement of third world approaches to international law was already the idea of disconnecting it from state-based projects, to say it is not the post-colonial state is not a victory, it is not the end game, that this struggle continues. So it's a move to create a continuation of some sorts. And to say that the form of the state, specifically the post-colonial state, is yet something else we have to resist and understand and unpack. And so it creates, in terms of geography then, the third world is not necessarily something that they used to map in the 50s and 60s, right? It opens up the meaning and all of that. That being said, I'm always careful not to then conflate third world traditions with indigenous traditions of struggle, despite those overlaps, especially in the context of North America. What's always interesting then for me as someone from Lebanon is the fact that my struggle is more in a post-colonial context. The Palestinian struggle, one can rightfully argue it is an indigenous struggle, but then the geography and history of those peoples are I mean, I'm sorry here. So now I'm asking, I'm making the naive point here of course, there are long-standing geographical and historical connections there. So I think keeping these categories dynamic and open is always the key, and being ready to do away with it. So if tomorrow, the movement of third world approaches says, we've been using this term since the 90s and it's just really feeling creaky, let's think of something else. Or there's a different connection of solidarity between indigenous peoples and those of us in sort of more post-colonial contexts, and let's create something new. I'm not wedded to third world as a concept. If we need something new, we do something new.
Yeah. So, Michael, that's really interesting. I just want to add from my own perspective, since like you, I also teach courses on the UN and this, and the frustration that Osama and others were talking about in terms of international law and the UN. I mean, of course, as you're saying, they're very valid and things that we all take into account. But part of the resistance, in a sense, is all of us complaining about the UN. So we complain about it, but then we talk about the Security Council, the US vetoed something at the Security Council, and that becomes something that we rally behind. The injustice of this, the unfairness of this, the idea that we should do something about it, the idea that power is against us, the idea that we're pushing up against something that needs to be called out. I mean, I think it's an important kind of aspect. The second thing that I also wanted to point out is that to a lot of people is, of course, the UN is not just Security Council, it's not just the ICJ. It's we're talking about what we want to get into now as well. So you're talking about the agencies. So we're talking about UNICEF for children. We're talking about FAO, etc., for the food. We're talking about all the legion of special rapporteurs, such as yourself, such as Francesca Albanese, who we had on this podcast, who are doing incredible work. And again, I want to emphasize for people that your work is independent. So you're not correct me if I'm wrong, but you're not a UN employee. You're assigned by the Human Rights Council, but you're entirely independent, which is why special rapporteurs such as yourself you're more free to say what you want without getting 100 layers of authorizations from the Secretary General onwards. I think that's important to point out. So I just to point this thing out. So as we kind of transition, I want to talk now about push you towards the question of Palestine and get into what's going on in Gaza today. And I want to one of the things in the UN again is the centrality of Palestine in the discourse of the UN. I mean, it's been from the very beginnings of the UN, and now and you can go trace it through all the decades, from peacekeeping to the responsibility to protect, to refugees, to all of this stuff. Palestine, the question of Palestine and its broader issues is something that's really quite central. And we see today in the question of Gaza today, the centrality. Again, we talked about the ICJ and the ruling of genocide and bringing back this question of genocide as a central argument in the world. And now also, so the question of food and starvation and famine and the kind of, how does one deal with this? Not in a natural, there's a drought going on. And so, what do we do? But it's more what appears very much to be a kind of willful, intentional stopping of humanitarian aid and causing kind of starvation and famine. So can you kind of run us through this? How, firstly, institutionally, how do you, as a special rapporteur, how are you assigned that file? Do you assign yourself that, or are you told, oh, please go talk about Gaza? How does that work? And where do you collect your information from? How does that work?
So being independent, it means we choose how we focus and what we focus on. So the fact that a large number of mandate holders of special rapporteurs, there's also what are called working groups and independent experts. All of this, we all have different titles, but they're all more or less the same thing. The fact that a large number of us decided to focus on Gaza independently is very telling. So I chose to focus on my last report on small-scale fishers. I chose to focus on the importance of seeds. I am choosing to focus on Gaza now as I am choosing to focus on Sudan, and I have focused on Yemen in the past. And the challenge is we're so limited in resources. I think people need to really appreciate what it means to do this. It's a full-time job, more or less. My mandate is food, there's water, there's housing, there's over 45 mandates out there. We all do this as a volunteer basis. It's more than a full-time job. We have to do this on top of our already existing full-time jobs. And then leaving aside, of course, family obligations in life and all of that. resources are very limited. We have very, very limited. We have one or two people who help us out in Geneva. We have a very limited budget based on our basic obligations of 2 country visits a year, if the countries let us in, and all of that. So where we get our information, a lot of it is through interacting with people, meeting with people, talking directly with people, getting testimonials, and it's receiving evidence, receiving information. We don't have the power to then verify its truth. What we have is the ability to say, this is worth looking into. This is worth, and we will send an official letter to a country saying, we see a serious problem here, you need to look more closely. Or we send it to a corporation, or we send it to a UN organization and say, you need to look more closely into this. We feel this is credible enough. So the job is partly it's advocate, but partly it's also an exercise of judgment. We have to make a judgment call, both as an interpretive matter and as a political matter, on what to focus on and how to focus on it, and how to describe it and how to frame it. So with very limited resources, we have a lot of power, symbolic, authoritative, political communication power. And the way I think, and the way that when I think of the job is by staying embedded and closely connected to social movements is a way of holding myself in check. So a colleague, another special rapporteur, gave me the best advice. He said, be bold, but be responsible. What does that mean? Every moment has its own context, and I have to make that calculation. And then the way that the UN, so it's fascinating. I'm so happy, Karim, that you sort of disaggregated the UN. It's a lot of different spaces and institutions, and some of it is autonomous and some of it is semi-autonomous. The way I do it is I can navigate these spaces very quickly. I get access to all of them. I'm either invited in or I can sort of try and push my way in. So I was invited to brief the Security Council 2 years ago on conflict and food security. This was in the context of Ukraine. So here I was briefing the Security Council through an informal session, but I don't believe that the Security Council is going to do anything, nor do I think it's legitimate. So what am I supposed to do? That was the challenge. And so I contacted comrades in this movement I'm part of, and I said, okay, first, what's the Security Council? Does it really matter? All I know is I can predict who's going to veto. I can predict that nothing's going to happen. And even if they pass a resolution, who cares? That's the position. What am I going to do with the Security Council? They gave me the best advice. They said, you're talking to the Security Council, formally speaking, but your audience is the General Assembly and New York. I'm like, oh, so that's a small example of how to use all these different institutional spaces almost against each other or in very strategic ways. I did this at the FAO in Rome, and they passed a particular resolution. Take what success we got in Rome and take it to New York. Something happened in New York at the General Assembly. Use what we got at the General Assembly when I go talk to national government in their capital. I'm nimble, and I'm not constrained by these discourses of trying that these institutions are trying to sort of really limit what is possible and create any change. So I can navigate and learn faster than these other institutional actors can, and I can use these institutional forces and dynamics really quickly to push against each other. That's how I see that. And we learn about where are the spaces of potential positive action, not just inaction in this running around these different institutional spaces.
So, Michael, just on that point, sort of as you engage with the UN Security Council and you're addressing the General Assembly and addressing, of course, the world, can you tell us a little bit more? I mean, what we see just from our televisions, from social media, from what we're following. I mean, the famine in Gaza, the engineered famine, the starvation of an entire people in Gaza. First of all, so what is actually going on right now? That's one question. And second question is, since you mentioned Ukraine, you mentioned, I think you also mentioned Yemen and Sudan. How is Gaza is Gaza? I mean, how does one compare the horror of what is going on in Gaza in 2023, 2024 with what's happened in these other cases? How does one make sense of this? Because I mean, we're of course all just absolutely appalled, as you can imagine, as you know, millions and millions of people around the world are, as well, and trying to put it in some kind of what's going on and how does it compare to other cases you've dealt with.
Yeah. And it's I'm always reluctant to sort of compare different horrors, but to understand context, I think matters. In Gaza, and this is talking to starvation experts all over the world, in Gaza, we've never seen a civilian population in modern history made to go hungry so quickly and so completely. That's what's really unique there. So since 2011, there's been an increase in famine and starvation. Famine is never a natural occurrence. It's always the result of political choices. And since Somalia, there's been an increased rate, more and more, which means that international institutions have been failing more and more in addressing the issue of food being used as a weapon. So when we get to this point in Gaza, where we've never seen so the number is 2.3 million people, over half of which are children, made to go hungry, and predictably, it was so preventable. So within weeks of the war, myself amongst other special rapporteurs who focus on water and housing and health, it's not by chance that those were the mandates that immediately raised the alarm on a risk of genocide, because we could see so clearly what was happening. Because on October 8th, Israel announced its starvation campaign. On October 8th, Israel said it. We're going to starve them. Basically, what they literally said was, we're going to make sure that there's no food, no fuel, no water into Gaza. And then they did it. Then they blocked all the water to northern Gaza. And there's been a clear campaign of starving everyone in northern Gaza as absolutely as possible to push everyone south, while they starve everyone at a slower rate in the rest of Gaza. And so it raises the question, how was Israel able to do this? That's the question I'm putting back towards everyone in the international spaces. How was this made possible? It didn't happen overnight, that Israel announces on October 8th they're going to do it, and then they do it, and then it happens, and it's all been predictable. So I sort of ease them into it. So I start with the 17-year blockade against Gaza. Sure. But this is a longer campaign. This is in the context of apartheid. This is in the context of settler colonialism. And it's not just about Gaza. So by focusing on food, it allows us to see the broader context, that the rate of settler violence in the West Bank in the last year and a half has been at record rates, with attacks against farmers, denial of access to olive trees and harvesting of olives. And the attack against UNRWA is not just an attack, of course, it's against refugees, but that's a denial of food, basically, or threatening food security of all Palestinian refugees in Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and the West Bank, and occupied West Bank, and East Jerusalem, and Gaza. So by focusing on food, you immediately see this context of, this is a full attack against the Palestinian people as a people, and Gaza is the epicenter of that attack, of the horror. But it gives you that the geographical sense, and of course the historical sense. It allows you to understand the 17-year blockade, the apartheid regime, and settler colonialism from the get-go, right? It clarifies, it allows me to explain it in these international institutional spaces in the 3 to 5 minutes that I'm given, in a way that's understandable. And I see people understand what I'm saying when I say it in those terms.
So, Michael, what kind of pushback do you get when you present this? I mean, are people convinced by what you're saying? I mean, it sounds, of course, I mean, I'm totally, obviously, we're completely, obviously, you know, on board with what you're saying. We're reading, we're following, and what you say makes absolute sense. But what kind of pushback do you get? Are you accused of being anti-Semitic? Are you accused of being X, Y, and Z? Are you accused of being biased? Are you accused of this? And what about the Western states that are so like on board with Ukraine, but here, you know, in Gaza are contributing to this catastrophe directly?
Yeah, I haven't. It's interesting. I receive a lot of positive feedback. What I get the most is large numbers of people coming up and saying, we've been unable to say what we needed to say, and you saying it allows us within our international institution to say it. So people within the UN are feeling afraid and silenced. And the biggest feedback I get is because of my independence and the way I'm using my independence, and I'm speaking regularly, clearly, concisely, is allowing then others to carry that message internally into their work within those institutions. That's the biggest, most consistent response I get. The second, I don't know how to translate it from Arabic. People come and they say, which is a similar sentiment, which is to say, like, you're expressing what I'm feeling, and I just want to say it, and I can't say it, not in political terms, but just in a almost like it's inside of them, and they just want to say it because I'm not using legal technical language. I'm relying on my legal analysis. I can back it up in legal terms. I can get technical if necessary, but the way I'm expressing it is in a way that is, I'm hoping, is a shared sentiment and a shared understanding that in a way that people are talking. And I think that's important as well of people hearing it in those terms. It's interesting, the first time I raised the issue of genocide was the third week of October. I happened to be at the General Assembly. I happened to be presenting in New York at the General Assembly. And so we did it in person, where we raised the alarm of what we were saying at the time, the risk of genocide. And Israel's response was, they said, we're the victim. They did not deny. I just raised a very serious accusation of a risk of genocide, which they could have responded with in a myriad of ways. What they chose to do is they shed tears in the General Assembly and said, no, we're the victims. A week later, I was at Rome at the UN Committee on World Food Security, which is one of the leading spaces on the right to food. It's a multilateral space, and civil society they have a very strong role in this space. And I said the same thing. I said I just raised the risk of genocide in New York at the General Assembly. I bring it to the UN Committee on Food Security, the same risk. And there was sort of uncomfortable silence in the room. And by calling out the United States on its hypocrisy, I read out the resolution from the year before. I said the UN Committee on World Food Security passed a resolution on Ukraine, and I read it out. And I said, you have to do the same on Gaza, at least, right? So there's something about, yes, international law is always filled with hypocrisy, but it's so vulgar now. It's out there. The part that's unique, here's the part that's interesting to me. Even in the war of Iraq and the torture and the occupation by the United States against Iraqi people, the US still felt it needed to justify torture through a legal argument and to justify the war in legal terms. With this one, it's like the US has walked away from international law. They're not even pretending or trying. If international law is a discourse that within it has both the ability to be imperial and a force of resisting empire, imperial and colonial powers are exiting international law in this war in ways I've never seen. That's what's interesting to me, that I'm not playing an ambiguous, complicated game of international legal discourse. Rather, it's those of us that are recognizing the horror for what it is are using international legal language in a way we've never used it before. We're changing. Already people, by mobilizing the streets, have changed and expanded the definition of genocide, right? Without being met with a counter argument in international law. I'm still processing this. I still don't know so that's what's new about this moment. I received the normal accusations, but they've been light compared to what like others have received, or like what Albanese has received in doing their line of work. So, but yeah, so that's how I've experienced it so far.
Michael, since few people know as much about the situation in terms of food specifically in Gaza, can you give our listeners, our audience, just like a quick overview? I mean, generally people are following. I mean, for example, we all hear about that statistic that's made the rounds about 80% of the people starving in the world, in the whole world, are in Gaza right now. We've heard about the cutting off of food distribution. As you reminded us, the Israelis declared a siege on. First of all, there's the 17 years of siege before, but the even more extreme form of siege imposed in early October. There's all that, but then, and so I'd like you to talk about that, of course, to say, like, where are we in this process of deliberately inflict, as you said, deliberately. There have been famines imposed before. Britain and Ireland, for example, in the 19th century was a very famous instance of that. But this is different because, first of all, because it's happening right now, and secondly, because it's not just about food assistance; it's also about, and I think you raised this when you talked about the fishermen. It's the Israelis are also very systematically going after, and they have been since 2006, 2007, going after Gaza's own capacity to feed itself. So in other words, it's not just about food security, it's about food autonomy too, right? Its ability to grow its own foodstuffs, its ability to have fishermen go out to sea to bring fish in, and all this kind of stuff. This so-called buffer zone that they're creating is essentially, it's basically where I don't know about the percentages and stuff, but it's a lot of Gaza's agricultural land, or formerly agricultural land, first of all, has been churned up, and secondly, it's all going to be this so-called buffer zone of the Israelis. So just, yeah, if you could just tell us where we are, both in terms of the actual, like, where are we in terms of starvation, hunger, etc., and then where are we in terms of the larger question about food autonomy as a kind of weapon of war that the Israelis are also using.
Michael, can I just add just as well, when you're talking about this, if you could, this business of even before the Gaza war, that I think around 80% of the stuff goes through, and the Israelis monitor it, and this kind of counting of calories. Is this a common thing, or is this, as usual, unique to the Israelis and the kind of regime of literally counting calories, again pre-October 7, counting the calories of all the food that kind of comes in, to make sure that they just stay alive, just at a certain amount.
You can quote Dov Weisglass, 2006. Dov Weisglass, 2006, the senior Israeli government advisor, saying we're going to put the Palestinians on a diet. That was 2006. That was like, where are we? But now it's not just a diet. Now it's like, it's much worse than a mere diet, right? Or calorie counting and so on.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so Israel imposes its siege 17 years ago against Gaza, punishing every person there, and to just exactly to both of your points. So what they did is they were denying the importation of just almost random stuff, but they were very calculated in they were counting calories. But what were they measuring? So there's a formal technical definition of famine. So there is an organization of independent experts affiliated with the Food and Agricultural Organization. It's called the IPC. It puts out its reports, and these experts created a technical definition of famine. And a famine is formally declared if three criteria are met. One, if at least 20% of the population is affected. Two, if 1 out of 3 children is acutely malnourished. And then the third measure is if 2 people are dying every day for every 10,000 inhabitants due to malnutrition, disease, starvation, not from bullets and bombs. So Israel knows this, right? And they know that if they set off these international alarms, they'll get in trouble. So the calories they're counting is to avoid triggering this sort of famine reporting, right? So by knowing the law, you know how to get as close as possible you can before you trigger all these these problems.
And to
is
be
the
clear,
way.
Michael, sorry, to be clear, you're saying this is before October 7th. This is
Correct.
going back. This is going back decades. Okay,
Yeah, going back 17 years ago.
17 years. Yeah.
Yeah. And that was that was life in Gaza. Now, as well as life in Gaza is also about the sea. It's about fishing. It's always, for millennia, it's about the sea. Fishers have been harassed, or were regularly harassed during this 17-year blockade. So in my direct conversations with fishers from Gaza, they said, before the blockade, you could have kind of a middle class living as a young fisher. You could have a family or live life and be fine. The blockade comes and it just pushes all the fishers into poverty. They harass them, they shoot nearby, they sort of deny them access to the sea, right? And this was in South Africa's submissions to the International Court of Justice. So when the war starts, what we know then is Israel because it had this control over the food system, it could just tighten. And so it was slowly strangling for 17 years. And as soon as the war started, it could tighten its grip. And so not only then is Israel denying and restricting humanitarian aid, and not only is Israel bombarding humanitarian convoys, even those convoys are coordinating with the IDF. And not only is Israel then shooting civilians getting access to humanitarian aid, it's destroying the food system. It's destroying agricultural land. It's using white phosphorus, which poisons the land into the future. It's destroyed Gaza port. The port of Gaza is totally obliterated. And so it's destroyed the food sovereignty, right? The food system. It's destroyed Palestinian people in Gaza. It's destroyed their ability to feed themselves by any measure. This is systemic. So it's systemic both looking back and looking forward. It's destroying it with an eye to damning the future. To give people a sense, then, to bring it back to this idea of famine. What's been interesting to me, people have been asking, "Oh, is there a formal declaration of famine? Why do we have to wait this long?" We know how bad it is. We know in January we started receiving reports that children were dying from malnutrition and starvation. At that point, that's the part when I started to realize, how is nothing happening? How can anyone watch? Because statistics only get you so far. And this is what I put to the Human Rights Council. And I said, if you have children, look them in the eye. Look them in the eye, because the horror, if you are not just a parent, a caregiver of a child, if you have any child in your life that you take care of, which is almost every human being, we're all around neighbors and uncles and aunts and all of that. If you imagine the horror is not just watching the child die before your eyes because of malnutrition. It's watching the child looking at you as the caregiver. That's the horror. That's the horror that we know is happening in January. We know this is happening. We knew it was going to happen. It was preventable. And yet here we are still. Here we are still. So which is why when you say if people are skeptical and fed up, organize and mobilize. Take your anger and express it and use it. Use it in your city councils, in your workplaces, wherever you are. Take all that feeling you have and use it to express your frustration, your dissatisfaction with the horrors we're allowing to happen in the world.
Oh, that sounds tough. Okay, Michael, sorry because there's the delay. Sorry, we'll knock this out. But so the question I have is sort of following this logic of what you're saying. First of all, just if you could just technically just tell us the difference between what is food sovereignty as opposed to food security. You threw it in, but I'm not sure. This even for a lot of us, it gets a bit confusing. That's just one as a side question, but. The question of intentionality. I was reading you had an interview or you were quoted in the Guardian where you say intentionally depriving people of food is clearly a war crime. Israel has announced its intention to destroy the Palestinian people in whole or in part simply for being Palestinian. So this is it part of your role to kind of prove an intentionality, or are you just laying out the facts and then someone else, like the ICJ in this case, or someone else, kind of is there to push an intentionality? And is there a difference between proving an intentionality versus doing whatever and they're starving as a result of what you're doing, whether the intention is to starve or not? Is that, I mean, maybe that's a kind of not a big thing, but I'm curious about that.
Yeah. No, those are great questions. Oh, and I just want to clarify something on a previous question. What makes the situation in Gaza unique is, again, how fast people were made to go hungry and how wide scale it was. If one had to compare, that speed and that totality has been very unique. And I think it's surprising for those that study starvation. It is not surprising if you understand the history of the Palestinian people, because it's in that history of settler colonialism and apartheid. To the point specifically on intentionality, and then I'll answer the question of food sovereignty and food security. Intentionality is operating in two ways in legal terms. There's the question of genocide. Genocide has a requirement of intent, and it's theoretically a high standard. It's been part of the reason why some people have said, "Oh, it is difficult generally to prove in legal terms genocide." The test for intentionality for starvation is not as hard as for genocide. So for genocide, you kind of have to show that they intended to commit genocide. They intended to harm in whole or in part a people as such. With starvation, the intent, you have to show that what they were doing was predictable. That that if you're going to block access in this particular way, or if you're going to do X or Y or Z, that it's going to lead to the denial of the languages depriving civilians of objects indispensable to their survival. So it's more of a cause and effect. Like if you know the cause of your actions are going to be starvation, then that counts as intent. So there's, in legal terms and technical terms, intention can mean slightly different things for different, I'll use the broader term, violations of international law.
Then there's the question of, okay, we've got these legal interpretations and these legal definitions. What's the role of the Special Rapporteur? So it's been interesting to me how reluctant certain UN actors have been to call this out as genocide, but they've been comfortable saying there are likely to be war crimes. So the Secretary General and the High Commissioner of Human Rights have said there's probably war crimes going on, but they've never said there's even a risk of genocide. When we've pushed them to say, why aren't you saying there's even a risk of genocide? They've fallen back on that's a legal definition, as if war crimes is not a legal definition. So this is interesting to me. And I truly don't understand what are the political stakes for them to call it out for what it is as genocide. Now, what's the role that I play? I have to exercise judgment, and I have to exercise judgment in real time based on the information I receive from confidential sources, from victims of human rights violations. I'm talking in general terms, from reports that we receive, from facts that we can research ourselves, from information we receive officially, formally and informally through UN organizations, through wide consultations, and ultimately based on my own expertise. That's the job. That's all special rapporteurs. That's what we're doing all the time. So when we're in a situation like this, we have the authority and the ability to call out violations of international law. That's also the job. And genocide is a big one in human rights. One does not have to wait for a court to make that interpretive call. And so when you hear UN actors fall back on, oh, that's for the courts to decide, or that's a legal definition or whatever, that's them avoiding answering the question. They have the same ability. They have different political constraints. To your question on the difference between food sovereignty and food security, food security was a term that was created in the 1970s through the UN as a way to try and highlight and politicize the problem of food and hunger. So remembering that in the early 1970s, there was a big famine in Bangladesh, amongst other places. So the world was seeing a higher rate of famine all over the world. And Amartya Sen his work, the famous economist, highlighted that famine is always a political failure. It is not the cause created by natural catastrophes. That's an aggravating factor, but it's always a political institutional failure. So the concept of food security was created to really prioritize the issue of hunger, malnutrition, and famine on the international political agenda, to say this is of the highest importance. And there were multiple attempts throughout the history of the UN, from the mid-1940s, from the beginning of the UN, to try and create some sort of a World Food Security Council, to make it as powerful as the Security Council itself. So the term had edge in the 70s, but like all concepts, it changes. And then it became a technical term that just meant access to calories. Okay, if you can eat a certain, it became a very small, narrow term. It had nothing to do with quality of food or any of that. The food sovereignty movement comes out of the 90s. It's a movement, first and foremost, of peasants, or what you could think of as small food producers. But it expands to small-scale fishers. It expands to pastoralists, but then to consumer groups. And the idea of food sovereignty is to focus on power. So using the notion of sovereignty, saying that the people are saying, we want food sovereignty, we want to reclaim more power in our food systems, because too much power has been concentrated in the hands of corporations and rich countries. So it identifies an antagonist as well. Food sovereignty as a concept highlights power, and by using sovereignty, focuses on the issue of land and water in terms of territory, with an ambivalence to existing national boundaries. So some countries put food sovereignty in their constitution, like Bolivia, whereas you can use food sovereignty to push against a state. So it opens up that sort of territorial understanding. So food sovereignty is a far more politicized concept that was carried and continues to be carried by movements, and it has not been diluted or co-opted yet.
Michael, thank you for that clarification. That's, again, incredibly helpful and productive. Just to come back to Gaza, so one thing you just said now in terms of the discourse around hunger and famine and so forth, and you were quoting Amartya Sen going back to the Bangladesh crisis in the 70s, is that famines are, and you said this before earlier, and I'm sorry if I'm going to misquote you exactly, but more or less you said that famines don't happen by accident, and it's not really about scarcity as such and so on. It has to do with, but then what you said vis-a-vis Sen was it has to do with failures of various kinds, right? And so surely one thing that you've been saying very clearly that distinguishes Gaza is not just the scale of it, but the deliberateness of it too, right? Which you've already said. But kind of as we sort of work towards a conclusion here, and I think you've kind of hinted at this, but just to draw this out, this same line, the deliberateness, and the other thing about famine specifically is how long the effect will last. Of course, one could say as opposed to bombing, but not really, because even if you survive, as the three of us know from our much more limited experience of war compared to what children in Gaza are going through right now, war has a lasting effect. Even if you don't get, none of us suffered a scratch physically in the war we experienced, but we're all still affected by it. We will be for the rest of our lives. And as I said, what we went through is nothing compared to what the kids of Gaza are going through, and of course the parents of Gaza, everybody in Gaza, right? But hunger it's a different, like, if the calculus there is not just mental strain or trauma and so forth. It's actually literal stunting. Well, obviously it could be death, but also even if you don't die, stunting, right? And which all of which can be quantified in these horrible kinds of ways. So what we're talking about here is the term laboratory is often used with reference to Israel doing what it does in Gaza, but there's a kind of laboratory here of playing literally with an entire generation of Palestinian children in Gaza. This is something that will have lasting effects generationally, maybe even across generations. I don't know, but just to have you think about that a little bit and help us think it through.
There's no doubt that this is going to have an effect for generations into the future of Gaza and all Palestinian people. Everyone who is Palestinian is experiencing this in very different ways. Of course, the most immediate is everyone in Gaza. And there's the biomedical effects of trauma and stunting. And there's intergenerational trauma. And there's existential trauma as well. So what will be required to ensure that people in Gaza can live with dignity and that all Palestinian people can live with dignity is now back on the entire UN, the entire international system that has been allowing this to happen. They are responsible to ensure every single person can live with dignity after this happens. What will this mean? This will be quantifiable. This is actually, and one can know what that requires. We can sit and figure this out. And so I think that needs, my colleague who's the Balakrishnan Rajagopal, who's the Special Rapporteur on Housing, has focused on recovery, and I would add reparations from the beginning. From the beginning. Who is responsible? People need to be reminded. So when we're talking about responsibility, it's not putting individuals in jail. Sure, people will try and do that. It's who is responsible to ensure that everyone can continue to live with dignity. And the way I've experienced this from the perspective that I've been coming from is international law is rife with hypocrisy, and it's rife with horror, and it's rife with violence. And it's filled with these moments and here I don't use the language of failure. It's sort of these cracks. This war in Gaza feels like one of the biggest cracks in the system that I've ever seen, as someone who studies also from a historical perspective. This is the choice we have. A crack is a crack. It's okay. It's a moment of violence. What happens with this crack is the choice. Will this crack let in more darkness into the world? Or will this crack actually be a moment that actually lets in light? That's the choice. We're in the moment now, truly now. And that's where I get the energy to keep the fight, to keep the struggle. That it's not, people say, how are you hopeful? I'm not hopeful. It's a choice. Do we struggle or do we not struggle? And we struggle to let light through that big crack.
Michael, thanks so much. I was just going to wrap up, but I want to just ask one last question. I was looking through your Twitter handle, your X, and I of course recommend all our viewers and listeners to follow you on Twitter, because it's you say and you also post really interesting things on questions of food and now these days on Gaza. You say in one of your tweets, you're quoting a report, and you say the struggle for food sovereignty in Palestine cannot be separated from the broader struggle for Palestinian self-determination and sovereignty. It is inherently impossible for a population to sustain themselves and the ecosystem to balance itself when it is under occupation. So this connection between food sovereignty, which the Israelis have been threatening for, if we're talking about Gaza, for these 17, 18 years, let alone now, and in the broader kind of, even in the West Bank and other areas where the whole system of food sovereignty, as you've defined it and explained it, is under tremendous threat. This kind of connection between food sovereignty and the broader struggle for Palestinian self-determination. Can you just kind of close on this and this kind of, can you get self-determination without proper food sovereignty?
So thank you. So Karim, you're quoting from a tweet I did that I'm pulling from a report
by a Palestinian organization, a food sovereignty organization, a peasant organization named the United Agricultural Working Committee. They're based in Ramallah, but they have members in Gaza, working with FIAN, which is the leading right to food organization in the world. And I worked with them. We had a food sovereignty panel as an event in the Human Rights Council, where we also had a lawyer from Al Haq present, Ahmed Al Fool, Abu Fool. And to your point, you cannot have any self-determination without food sovereignty. This is for any people. So the question I'm putting in my next report that I'm exploring still and consulting with others and thinking through with others is this. If the Palestinian people, like all people of the world, have the right to self-determination, and food sovereignty is one particular and important expression of self-determination, what does food sovereignty look like for the Palestinian people as a people that is, the phrase people use is fragmented across different forms of legal status and different and live in different places, and nevertheless are a people? And that's an open question, because you also have to start with what is Palestinian territory when you ask that. So it opens up things up in a way that I haven't heard asked in this particular context. And it's not to say I'm asking, it's not a rhetorical question. It truly is an open question that I want more and more people asking and debating and discussing, because that allows for nuance, that allows for different context, that we answer that question differently in historic Palestine versus occupied West Bank, for example. Food sovereignty will look different. It'll look different for refugees in Lebanon, for example. Nevertheless, to treat the Palestinian people as a people is the first step. And then the disaggregated part is not the people, it's the legal status and where they live.
Thanks so much, Michael. I think that's a very good point to kind of stop. And as we just all of us kind of look from a distance at this intentional starvation mechanism that Israelis are using now in Gaza, but also as you're saying, as you've very eloquently told us, this kind of broader, that we need to also this kind of the broader picture of food sovereignty and the struggle for food sovereignty across Palestine, and in particular, and we talked about this in several episodes of our podcast, on this kind of larger Zionist way of disaggregating, of fragmenting the Palestinian people, and so talking about food sovereignty in that sense also presupposes, in the kind of larger question of self-determination, presupposes that there needs to be a kind of a movement against the fragmentation, a kind of building together what is Palestine in its people, and both territory but also people, more importantly, as a building block to this larger struggle towards self-determination. So as we're witnessing this unbelievable genocidal war with starvation now, and all these kids that are dying of malnutrition and famine, we need to also you're reminding us to keep in mind these larger political questions at the same time. So thank you so much, Michael. This was very enlightening, and we really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, thank you to the three of you. I appreciated it.
Okay, guys. So, what do you think? I thought this was extraordinary, enlightening, depressing, of course, on the one hand, on the starvation, but enlightening in terms of the process by which the special rapporteurs work, the way in which the kind of legalities versus the realities kind of work. So, what did you guys think?
I mean, the sheer scale of what's happened, as Michael was saying, the sheer scale. That's part of what makes it unprecedented, is the scale of it, but also another thing that makes it unprecedented is the duration of it. I mean, as he was saying, it's really since 2006. But of course, you can take it all the way back to 67, but really, at least if nothing else, 2006. That the horrible Dov Weissglass, who said in 2006 we're going to put Palestinians on a diet. I can't remember when the thing was when they said this is the number of calories. I think it was 2008 or something like that, where they said, or maybe 2007, I don't remember, but it was early on in the siege of Gaza. This is the number of calories exactly intended to keep it hovering exactly at the precipice, as he's saying, not so much that it falls into official famine, because that's bad for Israeli PR, but nor are they comfortable enough that they can breathe, right? It's keeping an entire population at the edge. And of course, now they've plunged the entire population over the edge into outright famine and starvation and all, but the other thing, of course, is this business, the constant Israeli thing about we're not the occupying power, machasna, we're not occupying. But if you're not occupying, well, why are you the ones who get to determine, even if it's in Cyprus, every ounce of anything that goes into or out of Gaza? Obviously, you are the occupying power. The whole thing belies their endless lying and prevarication and equivocation and so forth. And maybe that's one of the worst things about the Israelis, is their endless capacity for prevarication and equivocation. But now we're talking about outright starvation, and yet they still continue to prevaricate and equivocate.
We didn't ask him. We should have asked him about the whole role of the Arab states and the scandal of the Arab states and their complicity in essentially sort of enabling this genocide in Gaza in the South.
Especially Egypt.
Well, all the states, all the Arab states that are all part of that have all the states that actually have relations with Israel that are basically essentially complicit in not doing anything, as far as we can see, to stop this horror from unfolding. And the Islamic, the Islamic sort of states, or the Islamic, what was it, the Islamic Congress, the OIC, and the Arab League states. I mean, so it's of course, first and foremost, it's the U.S. as the main backer of Israel and Israel itself, but then you have the Arab states playing this extraordinarily sort of disingenuous role. But then Michael also sort of said that he's never seen, or none of us have seen for that matter. We've talked about this study many times, right? We've never seen this level of solidarity and this level of support for Palestinians before. And so, and the idea that we're at a turning point now, and so much of our futures, our immediate future, our lives, not personally, but collectively, is going to be determined by how this war ends, how this genocide ends, and when it ends, and on what terms, and what does the UN do, and what role and do these
and
people?
What does the world do?
And what does the world do? And what do people of conscience do? And as Michael said, it was actually kind of surprising. He said
This
also,
is a test.
It's a test, but he also said, don't just wait. Go out and protest. Use your voice.
Go to your city councils. Go to anything you could do.
Do something. Educate yourselves and do something. Don't just sit there.
Yeah. And I just, for me, I think, just to add, I think what's interesting at the broader level is, and it again connects, I think, to several of our guests, which is questions of the fragmentation versus trying to rebuild the communities together. So what is Palestine? What is Palestinian self-determination?
Correct.
And trying to understand that, of course, there's the immediate crisis now that needs to be addressed. But then in the background, there's this larger politics through which the Israelis and the Americans now, and the Arab states that are working with the Israelis and the Americans, that absolutely need, in their so-called post kind of Gaza war, they need the fragmentation to continue.
Yeah, absolutely.
So with all the talk about get the Palestinian Authority to come into Gaza, that's all signals for fragmentation, because it has to be done only on the basis of defeat of Hamas, on the basis of exclusion of a certain segment of Palestinians and Palestinian people. So it's the whole thing is question of fragmentation versus reunifying. As we talked about Hanan Hashawi, for example, on the question of rehabilitating the PLO and so all these questions and so just to end with this idea of food sovereignty being part of this larger struggle for self-determination and unification to fight and to resist fragmentation. I think that's exceptionally important for us to kind of keep in mind. And in the meantime, we look on with the horror of these pictures and these images and the realities of not just kids, but I mean adults. As you say, you mentioned it's children, but it's also mothers and fathers and grandfathers and old people, and people are starving to death, and it's happening in front of us, and it's happening with this ridiculous thing of people dropping food from I don't know, from planes and helicopters, including the Jordanians and the Egyptians, and this total nonsense, and this is criminality, and it's absolutely these countries could easily put in food and go through and insist that these trucks go through. What's going to happen? The Israelis are going to attack Egyptian or Jordanian or other food aids?
No, or the U.S. constantly bleeding. We wish that they would do more. Wallahi, there's nothing we can make them do.
Yes, like, come on, but the U.S. we're saying are co-belligerents in this thing. Some of the other ones claim not to be. So this is an issue. Anyway, we need
or that guy, or what's his name, Kirby, saying there's no evidence. We have no evidence that Israel is violating international law.
Has ever committed a violation of humanitarian law. That's Kirby.
But the point is, at the end, I think we all need to recognize what Michael said, which is also that and what we all know, that each of us has a voice, and everyone, all our listeners and all our viewers also have voices. And, it could be a voice in the wilderness, but nevertheless, it's important to use that.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.